And now the Deeper Thinking Podcast, a daily exploration into how philosophy, psychology, and technology shape how we think, feel, and live.
Welcome to the Deeper Thinking Podcast. The air didn't change, but something in it withdrew. A pause you couldn't quite name, like a breath withheld by a room. Not silence, but structured quiet. Not censorship, but a kind of design, too smooth, too frictionless to be neutral. You could scroll forever and never touch anything that hurt, never feel resistance. And somehow, that became the point. It wasn't that someone told you no, it was that no one had to. The architecture had already decided, we mistake this for freedom. We mistake 1,000 curated options for choice. We mistake fluid access for openness when it might just be the cleverest form of closure, one that lets you move but never shift. Something about that contradiction trembles under the surface of everything now, like a staircase that always descends, no matter where you step. There's a feeling, barely perceptible, of being rehearsed, not in what we say, but in how we feel. An emotional pathing that anticipates desire before it forms, offering relief before you know what aches. And yet nothing is soothed. There is no villain, only systems tuned too finely to be seen. Perhaps this is what repression looks like now, not a buried trauma or private guilt, but an ambient script you didn't know you were following. Not what's hidden, but what's made invisible by being everywhere. And when you try to speak it, the words don't land. They feel too big for what's missing, or too small for what you sense. Something is off. The trouble is, nothing is obviously wrong. There's no loud prohibition, no trembling hand of authority, just a gentle curvature to everything, like the world has been slightly tilted and we've learned to walk without noticing. What once stood as repression, a blunt psychic barricade, has been sublimated into the surfaces, into touchscreens, into headlines that soothe, into platforms that whisper, this is what you like, and we nod before we even know what the options were. And so the feeling arises, not of being denied, but of being directed, not of censorship, but choreography. There's a script and it's breathable. But that's the trick. It feels like air until you realize you've forgotten how to cough. We inherited repression as a psychological inheritance. Freud etched it into the soul. But what happens when the soul itself is dispersed, when the subject is no longer the container of contradiction, but its conduit? When interiority dissolves into interface and the old binaries, desire and denial, are replaced by something softer, something smoother, something that doesn't block, only reroutes. There's a subtle violence in being endlessly permitted. In a world that never says no, there are only ever wrong yeses. And those yeses accumulate, each one a little more aligned to the system, a little less aligned to the self. If there even is a self anymore that's distinct from the system. Perhaps that's the question. Not what repression hides, but what it constructs. Not the secret, but the architecture that makes secrecy redundant. A repression so total it requires no enforcement, just design. There is a hum beneath this, not a scream, not even a warning, just the faint vibration of something disallowed by being diffused, something we almost remember and almost forget at once. Repression has always required an architecture, but only recently has that architecture stopped looking like control. It now resembles care, a curated feed, a well-tuned algorithm, an interface designed to eliminate friction. Everything is soft, efficient, and personalized, except for the part of you that starts to slip through the cracks. Because the more the world wraps itself around your preferences, the less room there is for the parts of you that don't behave, the inconvenient impulses, the unmarketable doubts, the kinds of feeling that take too long to process and don't fit in a notification bubble. The great innovation of the neoliberal psyche is not to forbid desire, but to overservice it. Not to say no, but to preempt the question. And this is where repression becomes infrastructural, when it stops being about denial and becomes about substitution, when it replaces rather than suppresses. You're not silenced, you're busy. You're not denied, you're distracted. You haven't lost anything, you've just forgotten what it was. The design is precise, not authoritarian but anticipatory. Every system tuned to make you feel like your needs are being met, while slowly repositioning what those needs should be. Want intimacy? Here's a swipe. Want truth? Here's a feed tuned to reinforce what you already believe. Want change? Here's a product that performs transformation without touching structure. Repression doesn't hide, it frames. And the frame is beautiful, so beautiful we no longer notice we're in it. This is not to romanticize an earlier form of repression. The disciplinary regimes of the past were brutal and visible, but their visibility was also a clue, a crack. You could name the thing you were pushing against. Now the edges are gone. Now the thing we're inside is everywhere and nowhere. Its silence isn't absence, it's absorption. So we keep clicking. We keep agreeing, we keep updating and syncing and consenting to what we don't read. And every time we do, the infrastructure gets a little tighter, a little smoother, a little more capable of preventing the very kind of resistance that would need no enforcement to begin with. It simply wouldn't occur. There's a peculiar intimacy to repression now. Not the kind that hides behind curtains or clinic doors, but the kind that lives in your pocket, vibrates in your hand, and wakes you up before you've even asked a question. It's repression as a feeling of seamlessness, of being known too well. A frictionless existence so tailored to your inputs that it leaves no room for interruption, no space to remember that interruption once mattered. You are never quite alone, never quite unobserved. But this is not surveillance in the old sense. It is accompaniment, recommendation, optimization. The system doesn't discipline, it suggests. And in doing so, it makes suggestion indistinguishable from desire. The more you're offered, the more you feel affirmed. The more you feel affirmed, the less likely you are to notice you've stopped asking for anything that wasn't already on the menu. This is repression via ambient consent. A world in which you've agreed to everything without having chosen anything. You scroll through curated outrage, perform approved transgressions, rehearse liberation in platform-compatible doses. You believe you are expressing, but you are echoing. You believe you are defying, but the defiance loops within architectures that metabolize it instantly. The old repressive state apparatus was visible. Police, law, punishment. The new one is invisible because it has learned to smile. It says, here is everything you want, just not all at once, just not all the way, just not in a form that would allow you to ask why you want it. And so desire loops inside a corridor of its own reflection, endlessly stimulated, never transgressing. This is not dystopia, it's too polite for that, too calibrated, too close. But it leaves you with a strange ache, the sense that something is missing but nothing has been taken, that something is wrong but everything works. This is repression not as trauma, but as design, not as silence, but as signal, not as fear, but as comfort, calibrated to a degree just shy of suffocation. We think of repression as a force that holds back, but perhaps it's time to think of it as a force that smooths over, that edits in advance, that whispers, don't worry, we've already felt that for you. We begin to misrecognize this smoothing as healing. A world that no longer shocks, no longer resists, starts to look like one that has matured, that has grown kinder, more thoughtful, more attuned. But the attunement is asymmetrical. It listens only to the parts of us it can use. It mirrors back only what already fits. In this way, repression doesn't just conceal, it curates. And curation is harder to argue with. It flatters the self even as it fragments it. What's left is a kind of psychic mulch. Too soft to plant anything new, too processed to resist. Your preferences become preloaded, your emotions become formatted, even your discontent is served to you in stylized form, pre-packaged for expression within sanctioned modes. You're angry, but only in ways that can be monetized. You're unsettled, but not so much that you unplug. The illusion of agency is preserved through constant micro-choices, each one reinforcing a system that appears to respond, but never yields. The genius of this repression is that it cannot be named without sounding paranoid. To describe it is to break the aesthetic. To name the infrastructure is to risk being labelled nostalgic, irrational, or worse, ungrateful. But still, something stirs. Not loudly, not even clearly, just a drift, a quiet suspicion that everything might be a little too responsive, a little too clean. That maybe the thing you're missing is not a product or a service or a freedom, but the friction that once reminded you that you were still real. And this is where repression achieves its highest form, when it doesn't need to repress anymore, when it builds the world in such a way that the question never arises, when memory of other ways of being becomes inaccessible not through force, but through atrophy, not deletion, disuse. What does it mean to live in a time when repression feels like elegance, when absence is styled to look like clarity, when the infrastructure of refusal has been so thoroughly updated it now wears the skin of hospitality? There is no door to unlock, no wound to excavate, only the faint outline of something that was once vital, now archived in the very systems designed to forget. The body still remembers, not in words, not even in thoughts, but in subtle hesitations, in the way your hand hovers before clicking, in the strange fatigue that follows a day of being perfectly accommodated, in the ache that comes not from collision but from perpetual calibration. Something inside resists being so well understood, so efficiently handled. And that resistance has no language, because the language has already been optimized away. It's here that repression re-enters, not as a concept, but as an atmosphere. You sense it in the feeling that something is always slightly off, but never enough to name. You carry it in the low-grade unease of seamless experience. You feel it in the dreamless sleep of systems that anticipate your every need before it becomes conscious. This is not the repression of content, it is the repression of context, the narrowing of what kinds of dissonance are allowed to rise. And yet, there are moments, brief ruptures, a glitch in the feed, a sentence that lands harder than it should, an expression on a stranger's face that doesn't resolve, moments that aren't quite permitted. Not repressed, exactly, just misplaced. And these moments shimmer. They don't offer answers, but they make space for questions that had no place in the design. Questions like, who am I when I'm not being served? What do I want that cannot be algorithmically known? These are not nostalgic questions. They are structural. They speak to the possibility that repression has not vanished but become spatial, embedded in the architectures we move through, the systems that shape our emotional bandwidth. In a sense, repression has become invisible, not because it is gone, but because it has been absorbed into the very scaffolding of perception. And this changes everything. Because if repression is no longer a force to fight, but a space we inhabit, then liberation can't be oppositional. It must be infrastructural too. It must begin with recovering the right to feel friction, to notice when something doesn't fit, to pause before accepting that seamlessness is a gift. In that pause, a kind of breach, not loud, not heroic, just wide enough to notice the design, just long enough to remember that not all silence is peace. Repression no longer arrives with force. It doesn't strike, it leans. It arranges the room so that you don't need to speak. It softens the interface until nothing sticks. It dresses in the language of empowerment, accessibility, mental health, digital wellness. But beneath it, the same logic holds, to narrow the range of what can be thought, felt, or remembered. Only now it does so through consent, through care, through exquisite design. This is not the removal of freedom, but it's careful orchestration. And it is in this orchestration that we begin to lose something elemental. Not liberty in the traditional sense, but a kind of emotional range, a capacity for disruption that used to signal aliveness. Now we move through systems that anticipate every move, correct every deviation, tune every mood. The world is polite, curated, frictionless, and in that it becomes unlivable, not through violence, but through saturation. Sometimes, in quiet moments, you feel it, a grief with no object, a memory of a kind of unruliness you can't trace. Not a rebellion exactly, but a noise that used to live inside you, a restlessness, a resistance, a rawness, now dulled, now managed, now folded into a rhythm that doesn't quite let you arrive. This is not a call to return to some imagined purity or past. There is no outside to the infrastructure, but there may be a rhythm within it that refuses, not with slogans or exits, but with presence. With a kind of attention that does not resolve into preference, with gestures that linger too long, questions that don't land cleanly, moments that don't perform. And so we return, not to escape repression, but to notice it, not to expose it, but to feel where it's been hiding in plain sight, in the layout of a form, in the phrasing of a notification, in the breath that catches just before you say yes to something you never asked for. There, perhaps, a faint hum remains. Not a wound, not a revolution, just the sound of the self remembering it once had edges. We are told that the system listens, that it is learning us, shaping itself around our patterns to serve us better. But what if the learning is a kind of forgetting? Not ours, but the system's, its refusal to remember what it cannot measure, what doesn't scan, what wobbles too much to be useful. Under this logic, repression isn't error, it's design principle. The data that doesn't fit is not denied, it is deleted. And in that deletion, we become smooth. Not because we've resolved our contradictions, but because they've been edited out. The anger that had nowhere to go becomes aesthetic. The grief that stayed too long is reclassified as dysfunction. You are still permitted to feel, but only in the tones that match the interface, only in durations that don't interrupt flow. Still, the body tries. It finds ways to glitch, to break pattern, a refusal to engage, an act of sleep, a silence that extends longer than it should. These are not errors, they are gestures of refusal. Not political in the traditional sense, but infrastructural. A lag, a delay, a space reclaimed not by argument, but by slowness. Because what repression now fears most is not resistance, it knows how to metabolize that, but ambiguity. Things that don't signal clearly, feelings that don't resolve, desires that don't map to outcomes. In these, a different kind of presence returns, one that doesn't collapse into the frame, one that stays complicated. Maybe that's the work now. Not to expose repression, but to confuse it. To make choices that don't add up. To let a sentence end in hesitation. To protect the parts of ourselves that aren't quite ready to be named. Not as strategy, but as care, as survival, as the only kind of freedom left when freedom has been pre-designed. Repression no longer asks for silence, it asks for clarity, for certainty, for emotional alignment with the system's mood. So when we linger, when we contradict ourselves, when we allow a line to tremble without fixing it, we are not failing to express. We are expressing what the system has no category for. That too is a kind of breach. There's a moment, subtle but decisive, when repression stops being something done to us and becomes something we help maintain. Not out of conformity, but because the alternative is too slow, too uncertain, too heavy to carry alone. We self-regulate not just our speech, but our seeing. We learn to flinch away from the image that doesn't resolve, to scroll past the ache that has no caption, to curate even our confusion into something legible, something shareable. This is the final twist. Repression doesn't erase feeling, it formats it. It wraps emotion in a syntax of compatibility. You can say you're exhausted as long as it sounds like content. You can grieve as long as it moves toward recovery. The system does not punish your complexity. It rebrands it as insight, as growth, as engagement. And so we internalize the tempo, the arc, the demand for conclusion. Even our attempts to resist come back to us as performance metrics. But somewhere deeper the raw persists, not as truth, not as purity, but as pressure, as an unplaceable urgency, a tension that the system cannot convert. It leaks into dreams, into the edge of gestures, into the blank stare between inputs. It is not revolutionary, it is barely even visible, but it marks a refusal, fragile, recursive, alive. We think repression is what hides the real, but maybe repression is what flattens the possible. It narrows the shape of what can be meant, what can be mourned, what can be desired. Its power lies not in what it denies, but in how it makes denial feel like agency, like choice, like rhythm. And so the only viable response may not be revelation, but slowness, a drag in the code, a line that loops, a breath held a moment too long. These are not mistakes, they are messages, not from the unconscious, but from the unformatted, from the part of you the infrastructure cannot yet pass. To live with that part without optimizing it, without explaining it, is perhaps the last form of ethical presence left. Not clarity, not rebellion, just the soft persistence of what cannot be simplified, the part of you that never agreed to be rendered seamless. There is no final act in systems that learn faster than we forget. No grand rupture, no scene of awakening, only drift, only subtle disorientation that grows too slowly to defend against. And in that slowness, a question. What if repression is no longer the shadow of civilization, but its glow, the light that blinds not by intensity, but by softness, by its refusal to let the dark fully arrive? This is the paradox we live inside. We are freer than ever to express ourselves, but expression has become another system of containment. It moves too quickly to allow meaning to settle. We say what we feel before we've even finished feeling it. We declare our truths in real time, and the archive fills up with things we no longer recognize. Repression no longer prevents confession. It floods the space with so much confession that nothing has time to become real, and yet something resists. Not loudly, not in speech, in pause, in the crackle of uncertainty before we respond, in the line we write and don't post, in the decision to let something stay unshared. These are the new sites of resistance, not because they defy power, but because they refuse its tempo, its hunger for immediate articulation. Repression once had content. It was about sex or violence or truth. But now its function is temporal. It moves in how quickly it asks us to move on, to process, to resolve, to be already past what we haven't begun to name. And so maybe the ethical act now is not to uncover, but to remain, to stay with what hasn't formed, to protect what falters, to leave a feeling unfinished. We close where we began, in the atmosphere. The feeling that something was withheld, that something leaned away just as you were about to touch it. But now we know what leaned away wasn't afraid. It was designed, and what remains is not the truth. It's the trace of what truth felt like before the system got to it. That trace still moves, still hums, not loudly, but enough. Enough to haunt the silence, enough to keep us from fully disappearing into the smoothness, enough to ask, what does it mean to remain rough, a little unreadable, in a world that prizes legibility above all? Until next time.
Thank you for listening to the Deeper Thinking podcast. This episode was digitally narrated by Holly, who helps bring our ideas to life. And thank you for your positive reviews on Apple Podcasts. They help us reach more people like you.